Imagine the air in a Viking home. It was often so thick with smoke that you could preserve a leg of lamb just by hanging it from the ceiling. There were no windows, no chimney, and in the dead of winter, the family's cows and sheep were sleeping just a few feet away. To us, it sounds like a suffocating, unsanitary nightmare. But for the Norse, this smoky, crowded setup wasn't a sign of ignorance. It was a brilliant, multi-purpose survival machine. It was an ingenious solution to the relentless challenges of the unforgiving North. What we see as brutal, they saw as a competitive edge. Before we deep dive into the history, my name is Boris, and I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what was the best part of your day? Feel free to share it in the comments below. And if you find comfort or curiosity in these calm history journeys, consider giving the video a like and maybe even subscribing for more. Now, settle in. Let's drift gently into the past. The Vikings. The name alone conjures images of ferocious warriors, horned helmets, which they didn't actually wear, by the way, and blood-soaked axes. Popular culture has painted them as one-dimensional berserkers, driven by a lust for gold and glory. But that image, as cool as it is dangerously incomplete. It's like judging a master surgeon by the blood on his apron without understanding the life-saving procedure he just performed. The truth is, the Vikings were more than just raiders. They were farmers, explorers, engineers, poets, and merchants. But above all, they were survivors. They didn't just endure one of the planet's most punishing environments. They thrived in it. They built a society that dominated Northern Europe for 3 centuries, and they did it not through brute force alone, but through a unique and often misunderstood brand of genius. Their world demanded a different kind of logic, a pragmatism so extreme it can look like cruelty to us. Many of their daily habits, their laws, and their traditions seem savage, even monstrous. But if you dig underneath the surface, if you strip away 1,000 years of change and look at these practices in their proper context, you find something startling. You find a hidden logic, a brutal necessity, a stroke of genius disguised as barbarism. Today, we're peeling back the layers of myth. We're going to explore 5 Viking habits that seem utterly brutal, but were, in fact, brilliant solutions for surviving and succeeding in their harsh world. From how they built their homes to how they raised their children, we'll uncover the clever thinking behind the apparent cruelty. This is a journey into the mind of the Vikings, where survival wasn't just a goal. It was the ultimate art form. Imagine stepping into a Viking longhouse on a freezing winter day. The first thing that hits you isn't the warmth, but the smoke. It's everywhere. A thick grey haze hangs in the air, stinging your eyes and catching in your throat. There are no windows, just a small hole in the roof for the smoke from the central fire pit to escape. The light is dim, the air is acrid, and the smell is a potent mix of burning wood, unwashed bodies, cooking stew, and livestock. That's right. In one section of this long, narrow building, maybe separated by a simple wooden partition, are the family's most valuable animals: cows, sheep, and goats. They're living, breathing, and doing their business just a few feet from where the family eats, works, and sleeps. Privacy isn't a concept. Fresh air is a distant memory from summer. The floor is just packed earth. From our 21st century perspective, this is a public health crisis. It seems incredibly unsanitary and unhealthy, a breeding ground for respiratory illness and disease. Why would a people as hardy as the Vikings choose to live in what seems like a dark, suffocating barn? Because the longhouse wasn't a flaw. It was a masterpiece of passive engineering. Every single element that seems awful to us was a carefully balanced feature with a hidden, life-sustaining purpose. It was a self-sufficient ecosystem designed for maximum efficiency. Let's start with the smoke. That constant choking haze was actually one of the most ingenious parts of the design. While the fire provided heat and light, the smoke it produced was a powerful tool. As it filtered up to the roof, it permeated everything. Hanging from the rafters were large cuts of meat and fish. The smoky air cured them slowly and steadily, preserving a vital supply of protein for the lean, frozen months of winter. That toxic-seeming air was a giant walk-in smokehouse, ensuring the family wouldn't starve. But the smoke did more than that. The creosote and tar in it coated the timber beams of the longhouse, acting as a natural preservative against rot and decay. It also worked as a fantastic insect repellent in the summer, driving away flies and mosquitoes that carry disease. The smoke literally sanitized the living space. Now, what about the animals? Bringing livestock inside seems gross, but it was a stroke of survival genius. A cow generates a lot of body heat, basically a small space heater. Multiply that by a whole herd, and you have a massive source of passive heating at no extra cost in firewood. The animals were furry, milk-producing radiators that kept the family from freezing to death. And yes, there was manure, but even that was a resource, composted for fertilizing crops in the spring. The very shape of the longhouse, long, narrow, and curved like an upside-down boat, was brilliant. The low, curved roof minimized wind resistance against the northern gales, and the lack of windows prevented precious heat from escaping. So, the Viking longhouse, which seems like a primitive, miserable place to live, was actually a sophisticated, multifunctional system. It was a home, a barn, and a food preservation factory all in one. The smoke that stung your eyes also cured your meat, and the animals that shared your space also heated it. It wasn't about comfort, it was about the genius of resilience, a perfect answer to the brutal questions of the northern world. This next habit is probably the hardest one for us to understand, let alone accept. It goes against everything we believe about protecting the most vulnerable. In the pre-Christian Viking world, it was an accepted practice for a father to decide if a newborn baby would be raised or if it would be left outside to die. This was known as barna utbyrda, or carrying out a child. The ritual was chillingly formal. After a baby was born, it was placed on the floor. The father, as head of the household, would inspect it. If he decided the infant was strong, healthy, and without any obvious deformities, he would lift it up, claim it as his own, and give it a name. But if the child was born with a disability, seemed weak, or was simply born into a family that couldn't afford another mouth to feed, he could make a terrible decision. He could refuse to pick the child up. This was a death sentence. The baby would be taken from the home and left in the wilderness, on a mountain or in a forest, to die from the elements or be taken by animals. To us, this is unthinkable. It's sanctioned infanticide, an act of supreme brutality. It feels like the work of monsters. How could a society that created beautiful art and complex laws possibly condone something so barbaric? To even begin to understand, we have to put our own morality aside and step into the brutally pragmatic reality of the Viking Age. Theirs was a world of razor-thin margins. One bad harvest or one harsh winter could mean starvation for the entire family. There were no social safety nets, no modern medicine, no resource surplus. Survival was a daily calculation of energy spent versus resources gained. In this cold, hard world, infant exposure wasn't seen as an act of malice, but as a desperate form of resource management. What future would a child with a severe disability have in a society built on intense physical labor? In a world without specialized care, they would require constant attention, draining the family's precious time and food. A family might have to choose between feeding one child who could never work and feeding the healthy children who could. The same grim logic applied to healthy babies born during a famine. If the food stores were almost empty, bringing another mouth to feed could put everyone at risk. The horrifying choice to expose one infant might be the only way to ensure the survival of its parents and older siblings. It was a choice between a certain death for one and the possible death of all. The power of this decision rested with the male head of the household, reflecting a patriarchal society focused on legacy and resources. Female infants were sometimes exposed as well, likely driven by a preference for sons who could inherit land and become warriors. This wasn't done lightly. The sagas hint at the sorrow involved. It wasn't about a lack of love, but about love being overruled by the overwhelming need to survive. The practice was so ingrained that Christian missionaries later found it one of the most difficult pagan customs to eliminate. The genius here isn't kind or gentle. It's the genius of a battlefield surgeon performing triage, making impossible choices to save as many as possible. It's the ruthless logic of a people clinging to survival. By making the brutal choice to cull the weakest or the unsupportable at the very start of life, they ensured their limited resources went to those with the best chance of growing up strong and contributing to the clan. It was a heartbreaking and, to us, indefensible practice. But in the unforgiving world of the Vikings, it was a logical solution to the constant threat of extinction. Imagine a dispute in the Viking Age. Maybe a man accuses his neighbor of stealing a cow, or maybe an insult is thrown, a challenge to a man's honor that can't be ignored. Today, that would mean lawyers and courtrooms. In the Viking world, there was a faster, more direct, and much more brutal solution: the holmgang. The holmgang was a legally sanctioned duel, a trial by combat used to settle all sorts of disputes. This wasn't a street fight. It was a formal, ritualized event. A public challenge was issued, and the duel would happen a few days later. Anyone could challenge another man over property, debt, or most importantly, honor. Refusing a challenge meant being declared a nidinga, a word for a coward and social outcast, a fate many considered worse than death. The rules were set. The fight might happen on a small island or a marked-out piece of land to keep anyone from running away. Each man got a set number of shields. They would take turns striking. In its early form, a holmgang was a fight to the death. The winner not only proved his point, but often got to claim the loser's property. Later on, it became more civilized, sometimes ending at first blood. This sounds like a recipe for chaos, right? A legal system based on who's better with a sword. It seems like the very definition of might makes right, a brutal system where the strong could legally rob and murder their way to the top. And yet, the holmgang wasn't about creating chaos. It was about containing it. Its brutal appearance masked a genius social function, to provide a final, decisive end to conflicts that could otherwise explode into devastating, multi-generational blood feuds. You have to remember, Viking society had no police force to enforce laws. Justice was a community affair, and honor was the currency that held it all together. An unresolved insult or a broken promise could spiral out of control, pulling in families and clans, leading to revenge killings that could destabilize an entire region. The holmgang was a pressure valve. It took a widespread conflict and trapped it in a small circle on the ground. It isolated the fight to the two people involved and provided a clear, final resolution. Win or lose, dead or alive, the matter was settled. It was a way to short-circuit a blood feud before it could even start. This idea of controlled, strategic violence extended to something even more infamous: the blood eagle. According to later sagas and poems, this was a horrific ritual execution for the most hated enemies. The victims' ribs were supposedly severed from their spine and their lungs pulled out through their back to create a pair of bloody wings. Now, scholars fiercely debate whether the blood eagle was a real practice or just a literary invention by Christian writers to make the Vikings look like monsters. We'll likely never know for sure. But whether it was real or myth, its story served a powerful purpose. The genius of the blood eagle isn't in its gruesome details, but in its function as a tool of terror. If it was real, it was an extreme form of public violence designed to send an unforgettable message, cementing a ruler's authority and terrifying any potential challengers. An execution this horrific would be talked about everywhere, creating a reputation that was a weapon in itself. Even if it was just a story, it was an effective one. The tales of the Blood Eagle helped build the Viking reputation for ferocity. That reputation did half the work for them, sowing panic long before their ships ever hit the shore. So, from the formal duel to the legendary horror of the Blood Eagle, the Vikings used violence in a calculated way. It wasn't just mindless savagery, it was a system of social control, dispute resolution, and psychological warfare, perfectly adapted to a world where a fearsome reputation was a vital tool for survival. The brutality wasn't the point, it was the means to an end, and that end was order, not chaos. Picture the menu at a Viking feast. You might be offered harkarl, chunks of Greenland shark that have been buried to ferment for months, then hung to dry, giving off an ammonia smell so strong it'll make your eyes water. Next to that could be svid, a boiled sheep's head, wool singed off, eyeballs staring blankly from the plate. For your daily meal, you could look forward to gritty porridge and dried, salted fish that's as hard as a board. To our modern palate, the Viking diet sounds unappetizing at best and downright disgusting at worst. It seems monotonous and stomach-turning, a cuisine born of pure desperation. We imagine them lacking fresh vegetables and relying on foods that sound more like a dare than a meal. But dismissing the Viking diet as primitive is missing the point entirely. It was, in fact, a masterclass in food science and preservation, perfectly engineered to fuel a demanding lifestyle through some of the toughest seasons on Earth. The things that seem gross to us were the keys to their survival. The cornerstone of this diet was preservation. Summer and autumn were times of abundance, but winter was long, dark, and frozen. To survive, everything had to be preserved, and the Vikings were masters of it. They smoked, dried, and salted their food. Fish, a staple rich in protein, was hung on racks and dried by the cold sea wind until it became stockfish, a food so durable it could last for years and was perfect for long voyages. Now, let's go back to the infamous harkarl, the fermented shark. There's a very specific genius behind this. The Greenland shark is plentiful in the North Atlantic, but its flesh is toxic when fresh, full of a natural antifreeze that would poison you. Through trial and error, the Vikings developed a unique detoxification process. They buried the shark in a gravelly pit, which pressed out the toxic fluids and fermented the meat over several weeks. Then it was hung to dry for months. The result was not just edible, but a high-energy food packed with protein and fats, perfect for winter. Harkarl wasn't a punishment, it was a brilliant scientific solution. Their everyday diet was also more balanced than you'd think. They grew hardy vegetables like cabbage, onions, peas, and beans, and foraged for wild greens and vitamin-rich berries. Porridge was a calorie-rich superfood, the perfect fuel for a long day of farm labor. Dairy was another pillar. They had cows, goats, and sheep for milk, which they turned into butter, cheese, and skyr, a high-protein food similar to yogurt that's still popular today. Nothing went to waste. That boiled sheep's head, or svid, represented a philosophy of using every part of the animal, providing nutrient-rich meat and fat. The Viking diet was the ultimate expression of pragmatic nutrition. It was a high-fat, high-protein engine designed to power them through cold weather and grueling work. What seems brutal to our taste buds was a stroke of culinary and scientific genius that let them conquer the North. In our popular imagination, the Viking world seems like a man's world. We picture women as passive figures at home, or worse, as prizes won in battle. From this angle, Viking marriage looks brutal and transactional, a contract between families where a woman was basically property, passed from her father to her husband. And on the surface, some of that is true. Marriages were often strategic alliances to combine wealth and power. They were more like business mergers than love stories. The sagas are full of fathers arranging marriages for their daughters to seal a peace treaty or gain an ally. This seems like another example of a brutally male-dominated society. But if you stop there, you miss one of the most radical and brilliant parts of Norse culture. While getting married might have been a transaction, a woman's position inside that marriage was astonishingly powerful and independent for the time. A married Norse woman was not her husband's property. She became the manager of the entire household, a role with huge authority. The symbol of her status was a ring of keys she wore at her belt. These weren't for show, they symbolized her control over the farm's food, finances, and the family's wealth. When her husband was away raiding or trading, often for months or years, she was the undisputed boss. She ran the farm, managed the money, and made all the decisions. She was running a complex business. This status was backed up by law. A woman could own and inherit property. While sons were favored, she always kept ownership of her dowry, the wealth her family gave her at marriage. This gave her an economic independence that was almost unheard of in other parts of medieval Europe. But here's the most startling proof of a Viking woman's power: her right to divorce. At a time when marriage was a permanent sacrament in Christian Europe, Norse society was much more practical. A woman could divorce her husband for many reasons: if he was a bad provider, if he was neglectful, or if he was violent. A husband striking his wife was grounds for divorce. To get one, a woman just had to declare her intention in front of witnesses. Upon divorce, she had the right to take back her full dowry and often a share of the couple's property. This financial security made divorce a real, viable option. In fact, a 10th century Arab traveler who visited a Viking trading town wrote with shock and amazement that women there had the right to divorce their husbands whenever they wanted. So, the genius of the Viking marriage system was its deep pragmatism. By giving women real authority and legal rights, Norse society made itself more stable. With men so often away, they needed strong, capable, and empowered women to keep everything running. Giving them the power to run farms, own property, and leave a bad marriage wasn't about modern feminism. It was a brilliantly practical solution for their society. The brutal arranged marriage was actually a framework for a partnership that recognized and protected the vital role of women, making them not just wives, but essential pillars of the Viking world. So we've journeyed past the stereotype of the mindless berserker. We looked beyond the fire and fury and into the homes, families, and laws that shaped their world. And what we found wasn't simple brutality. It was a complex and often brilliant pragmatism forged in the fires of a harsh reality. We saw it in their smoke-filled longhouses, which weren't primitive huts, but sophisticated machines for living that warmed the family and preserved their food. We faced the difficult truth of infant exposure and saw it not as casual cruelty, but as a desperate form of triage, a ruthless calculation to ensure the family's survival. We saw that the violent Holmgang duel was a clever way to prevent society from collapsing into endless blood feuds. We learned that a diet of fermented shark wasn't a punishment, but a triumph of food science that fueled them through the darkest winters. And we found that behind their arranged marriages was a system that gave women surprising power, making them not property, but partners. In every case, a habit that looks brutal at first glance reveals a hidden layer of genius, a hard-won wisdom that allowed the Vikings not just to survive, but to dominate. Their solutions were often harsh, sometimes heartbreaking, because their world demanded it. The Vikings teach us that genius isn't always pretty. Sometimes it's rugged, practical, and born from pure necessity. They were not just barbarians, they were brilliant survivors. Their story is a powerful reminder that context is everything and that true ingenuity often wears a brutal disguise. If you were fascinated by the hidden logic of the Vikings, you won't want to miss our next video where we explore more of history's most misunderstood figures. So be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past. And let us know in the comments which Viking habit you found the most surprisingly brilliant. The history of Viking conquerors, how the elite lived. A sword dripping with the spoils of war. A longship cutting through the icy sea. That's the Viking we all think we know. But what if I told you the true measure of a Viking lord's power wasn't just the terror he caused on the battlefield? What if it was the silent authority he held from his high seat in a smoky hall? What if the greatest conquerors of the Viking age won their power not just with an axe, but with a handshake, a plot of land, and a carefully poured horn of mead? Forget the raider for a moment. We're about to uncover the real story of the Viking elite and how they truly lived. The Viking age. It immediately brings some powerful images to mind, right? Fierce warriors, masters of the sea, bursting out of Scandinavia to raid, trade, and settle across Europe and beyond. Their stories, the sagas, are filled with epic battles and a serious thirst for glory. But that popular image, while not totally wrong, is missing a huge piece of the puzzle. It focuses on the action and the violence, but it overlooks the very foundation of Viking society: power, wealth, and the complex social ladder that held it all up. The people at the very top of this world, the kings and powerful nobles we know as jarls, were so much more than pirates. They were the aristocracy of the North, the 1% of their time. Their lives weren't just one raid after another, but a careful balancing act of politics, economics, and social climbing. To really get the Viking age, we have to look past the front of the longship and into the heart of their world, the great halls, the huge estates, and the busy trade hubs they controlled. This is the story of how the Viking elite actually lived. It's a story not just of plunder, but of property, not just of fighting, but of feasting, not just of conquest, but of control. We'll explore where their immense wealth came from, which often had more to do with a good harvest than a bloody battle. We'll step inside their amazing longhouses, the centers of their political and social power, and we'll discover a world where your status was written in the fine silks you wore, the intricate jewelry that you flashed, and the lavish parties you were expected to throw. This is the untold history of the Viking conquerors, a look at the lives they led when the fighting was done, in the halls of power where legacies were truly made. First things first, to really get the Viking elite, we have to update our definition of a conqueror. The most powerful men in Norse society were the jarls, a noble class of chieftains who were second only to kings. In the early days, a guy might become a jarl through his skill in battle. But as Viking society got more complex, the role of the jarl changed from a simple war chief into a sophisticated political operator, a regional boss who was one of the real power brokers of the Viking world. These men were the lords of the land. While a king might rule over a huge, sprawling territory, it was the jarls who handled the day-to-day business of power. They ran specific regions, sometimes for a king, but often with a whole lot of independence. This setup, with power spread out, was exactly what you needed in an age of exploration and settlement. It allowed for things to actually get done locally across the massive Viking world. A jarl's power wasn't just about how many warriors he could call up for a raid. It was measured by the size of his lands, the loyalty of his people, and his influence in the community. Sure, he was a military commander who had to train and equip his own personal squad of bodyguards, known as a herd. But he was also a manager and a judge. Jarls had to keep the peace, collect taxes, and settle arguments in their territory. They even ran the local assemblies, called the Thing, which was the democratic heart of Norse society, where laws were made and justice was served. To do that, you needed more than just muscle. You needed wisdom and a deep knowledge of Norse law. So, the most successful Jarl wasn't always the most brutal raider. He was the most strategic leader. He was a politician, navigating a messy web of alliances and rivalries. He was an economic powerhouse, and he was a pillar of the community who understood that real power wasn't just built on fear, but on generosity, honor, and respect. Being good at fighting was definitely part of the job description, but it was just one tool in a much bigger toolbox. The real conqueror was the one who could win a battle, but also manage a farm, seal a trade deal, and command loyalty long after the swords were put away. The real source of wealth and status in the Viking world wasn't a chest full of silver. It was the ground beneath their feet. Land ownership was everything. A jarl's influence was directly tied to how big and how productive his farms were. The richest lords owned huge areas of land, sometimes dozens of farms that were all worked by other people. These lands produced a steady flow of everything from grain and cattle to timber and iron, and that was the economic engine that paid for their fancy lifestyles and political games. Most Vikings were free farmers called carls who worked their own land, but many others were basically tenants on a jarl's estate. They worked the land and paid him in food and goods. This system created a very clear social pyramid, with the landowners at the top, supported by the work of everyone else. At the very bottom were the thralls, or slaves, often captured in raids or just people who fell into debt. Thralls did the hardest labor on the farms and had no rights at all. So, a jarl's life was deeply tied to the rhythm of the seasons. While they were off leading raids or playing politics, a huge part of their job was just making sure their lands were well managed. They needed good harvests, healthy livestock, and a steady production of resources. A successful lord was a prosperous lord because that wealth translated directly into power. It meant he could feed his huge household and his warriors, have extra to sell, and throw the huge parties that were so important for his reputation. This connection to the land was more than just business. It was about identity and legacy. A jarl's estate was his kingdom in miniature, a physical symbol of his power. We often imagine Vikings as constantly at sea, but for the elite, life was rooted in the soil of their homeland. They weren't nomads, they were landlords. The loot from a raid might fill a treasure chest for a season, but the steady wealth from a well-run estate could keep a family in power for generations. While land was the stable foundation of a jarl's power, the elite didn't put all their eggs in one basket. They actively grew their income through a smart mix of trade, tribute, and, of course, plunder. The Viking Age was a time of incredible economic energy, and the elite were sitting right in the middle of it, controlling how goods and wealth moved across huge distances. Viking merchants were some of the best of their time, and powerful jarls and kings often controlled the most important trading towns and routes. Their amazing longships could handle both the open ocean and shallow rivers, which let them build trade networks that stretched from North America all the way to the Middle East. They sailed down the rivers of Russia to connect with the Byzantine Empire and the rich caliphates of the Arab world. From the north, they shipped out valuable stuff like high-quality furs, timber, honey, amber, and walrus ivory, and in return, they brought back the luxury goods that were the ultimate status symbols for the elite. We're talking fine wine from Germany, glassware from France, and exotic treasures like shimmering silks from China and Byzantium, gems from India, and massive amounts of silver coins from the Arab world. The fact that thousands of Arab coins have been found in buried hoards across Scandinavia tells you everything you need to know about how profitable this trade was. Tribute, or taxes, was another big income stream. Jarls and kings collected payments from the people living on their lands, which guaranteed a steady flow of resources. This system cemented their authority and gave them the money to pay for their soldiers and run their territories. And then there was raiding. The popular image of Vikings sacking monasteries is definitely based in reality. These raids were a direct and brutally effective way to get rich quick, especially when it came to precious metals, weapons, and slaves. For a young warrior, a successful raid was one of the best ways to build your own wealth and reputation. A leader who brought his men home loaded with loot would see his influence skyrocket. But it's better to see raiding as just one part of a larger economic plan. The shrewdest leaders understood that real, long-term wealth came from a combination of all three: the steady income from land and taxes, the big profits from trade, and the high-risk, high-reward jackpots from raiding. The heart of a Viking lord's world was his home, the great longhouse. These weren't just houses, they were giant billboards advertising your power, wealth, and social status. They were the center of political, social, and family life. The size of your longhouse was a direct reflection of your standing. An average family might live in a house that was 15 to 50 feet long, but the halls of powerful jarls, they could stretch for over 250 feet, completely dominating the landscape. Built mostly from timber, with walls of wood, turf, or stone, these long buildings were masterpieces of Norse engineering. They had these signature curved roofs, kind of like an overturned boat, that were designed to handle fierce winds and heavy snow. Inside, the huge open central hall was the main event. A long rectangular fire pit ran right down the middle, providing light, warmth, and the place for all the cooking. Smoke just found its way out through a hole in the roof. This central hall was where everything happened. It's where the Lord, his family, and his personal bodyguard of warriors, the herd, all gathered. Benches lined the walls, used for sitting during the day and sleeping at night. The most important people, of course, got the best seats. The Jarl himself would hold court from a high seat, a throne-like chair that was a clear symbol of his authority. From there he'd entertain guests, hold meetings, and settle arguments. For the elite, the Longhouse was a crowded, bustling place, home to not just the immediate family, but also their warriors, servants, craftsmen, and any visitors who might be passing through. And in many of the biggest longhouses, one end was even walled off to shelter valuable livestock during the winter, a practical design that also used the animals' body heat to help warm the place up. But more than just a home, the longhouse was a public stage. This is where political alliances were sealed, war strategies were planned, and justice was handed out. It was a workshop where all sorts of crafts took place, especially during the long, dark winters. And most importantly, it was the venue for the grand feasts that a lord's reputation was built on. The longhouse was a symbol of the Jarl's power to protect and provide for his people, a place of community that stood as a giant monument to his success. Inside that smoky longhouse, no event was more important than the feast. These were not just big meals, they were powerful political events that were absolutely essential to how Viking society worked. Throwing a great party was one of the best ways for a lord to show off his wealth and generosity, two things that were cornerstones of his honor and authority. If you could provide tons of food and drink for your followers, it was a clear sign that you were a successful leader. Feasts could be held for all sorts of reasons: to celebrate a successful raid, a wedding, a religious festival like Yule in the winter, or just to strengthen the bonds between a chieftain and his people. These parties could go on for days. The long tables would be piled high with food that was way better than the everyday stuff. Roasted and boiled meats were the main attraction, with pork being a special favorite, along with beef, lamb, and game like deer and wild boar. There was plenty of fish, and vegetables like cabbage and onions were served on the side. Of course, a key part of any good feast was drinking, a lot of drinking. Ale was the common beverage, but the real prestige drink was mead, a strong wine made from honey. Drinks were served in fancy horns or cups, and the act of toasting, known as the sumbel, was a serious ritual. Toasts were made to the gods, to the memory of famous ancestors, and to the health of the Jarl. This was also the time for making big promises, bragging about your accomplishments, and declaring your loyalty. The feast was also where you got your entertainment. Professional poets, called skalds, would recite epic poems about heroes and the great deeds of their host, basically acting as a living history lesson and a PR agent all in one. There was music, storytelling, and games, all creating a lively atmosphere that brought the community together. Even where you sat was a map of the social order. The most honored guests sat closest to the Jarl, while people of lower status were further down the hall. A feast was like Viking society in miniature, a place where power was put on display, loyalties were locked in, and the community came together under the roof of their leader. It was politics with a full belly and a raised drinking horn. In a society with a very clear pecking order, showing off your wealth and status was incredibly important. For the Viking elite, your clothes, jewelry, and weapons weren't just functional. They were a way of telling everyone around you who you were and where you stood. You could spot the difference between a Jarl and a regular farmer from a distance. While a common farmer wore practical, plain-colored wool, the elite could afford finer fabrics and bright colors. Dyes were expensive, so colorful clothing was a clear sign of wealth. Blue and red were especially popular. The richest of the rich could even get their hands on silk, an unbelievably precious material imported from places as far away as China, which they would use for trim or hats. Fancy embroidery and woven patterns also made the clothes of the rich stand out. Jewelry was maybe the most powerful status symbol for both men and women. They wore it proudly, often in layers, and it was made from bronze, silver, and gold. High-status men and women wore ornate brooches to fasten their cloaks, with the size and material shouting out their wealth. Arm rings and necklaces were a huge deal. Often made of heavy, twisted silver or gold, they weren't just decoration. They were a form of wearable money. A Jarl could reward a loyal warrior by giving him an arm ring, or even by literally hacking a piece off a larger one. Elite women wore incredible jewelry that showed off their family's wealth and their own power in the household. Strings of colorful glass beads, amber, and precious stones were common. A pair of large oval brooches were a signature piece of a high-status woman's outfit, used to pin the straps of her dress. And finally, a warrior's weapons were also a billboard for his status. While most Vikings had an axe or a spear, only the wealthy could afford a finely made sword. These swords were often status symbols in themselves, with handles beautifully inlaid with silver and copper. They were passed down through generations or given as gifts of high honor. From the color of their clothes to the weight of the silver on their arms, the Viking elite made sure their power was always on display. The children of Viking Jarls weren't left to have a normal childhood. From a very young age, they were groomed for a life of leadership and responsibility. Their upbringing was basically a training program designed to give them all the skills they'd need to keep their family on top in a very competitive world. For boys, military training was everything. They learned to ride horses, handle a sword and shield, and fight as a team. This wasn't just about self-defense. It was about preparing them to lead men in battle, a basic job requirement for any future chieftain. They learned strategy and tactics not just from drills, but from listening to the stories of their fathers and the skalds, who told tales of great battles and heroes. But it wasn't all about fighting. An elite son also had to learn how to govern. This meant understanding Norse law so he could run the local thing assembly, settle arguments fairly, and manage the resources of a huge estate. They were taught how to play the dangerous game of politics, making alliances with other powerful families and securing their spot through both strength and smart negotiating. While they didn't have schools, Literacy in the form of reading and carving runes was an important skill. Strategic thinking was sharpened through board games like Hnefatafel, a game of tactics that was like a Viking version of chess. The education of elite girls was also very specialized. They learned all the skills needed to run a huge and complicated household, which was a kingdom in itself. But their education also included politics and property. They needed to understand inheritance laws and how to manage the estate, because they'd often be left in complete charge for months or even years while their husbands were off trading or raiding. A good marriage was a cornerstone of political strategy, and an elite woman was expected to be a capable and influential partner. For the children of the elite, their entire childhood was preparation for the high-stakes game of power they were born into. Despite the stereotypes of a male-dominated warrior society, women of the Viking elite held a surprising amount of power. While men held the formal titles of command, high-status women had a degree of freedom and authority that was pretty amazing for the time. They were not passive figures stuck in the home. They were matriarchs, landowners, and strategic partners who were absolutely vital to the success of their families. The main domain of an elite woman was the great longhouse and the estate. She was the husfreyja, the lady of the house, and that title came with real authority. The keys she wore hanging from her belt weren't just for show. They were a powerful symbol of her control over the household's valuables, including the locked chests of food, textiles, and silver. When her husband was away, which could be for months or years at a time, she took over complete management of the entire estate, and that was a huge job. It meant overseeing the farm, managing servants and slaves, and making sure the entire community survived and thrived. Viking women also had significant legal rights, much more than women in many other parts of Europe. They could own property, inherit land and wealth, and even run their own businesses. And critically, they had the right to divorce. A woman could decide to end a marriage and take back her dowry and any property she brought into it, giving her a level of financial independence that was exceptionally rare. These women were also key players in the political games of the elite. As mothers, they raised future leaders. As wives, they were often trusted advisors. Their marriages were frequently strategic alliances between powerful families, and their ability to keep the peace and mediate arguments was highly valued. The famous Oseberg ship burial, one of the richest Viking graves ever found, held the remains of two high-status women. They were buried with unbelievable wealth, including a magnificent ship and luxury goods, which is a clear sign of the power and prestige they held in life. The women of the Viking elite weren't just behind the throne. They were often the very foundation it was built on. Life at the top of Viking society came with incredible perks, but it was also a life on a knife's edge. It was full of danger, pressure, and huge responsibilities. The power and wealth of a jarl weren't guaranteed. They had to be constantly defended and maintained. Central to a leader's life was the idea of honor, or doma. This was basically your reputation and the legacy you would leave behind. Protecting your honor was job number one. An insult couldn't be ignored, and a challenge had to be met. This often led to violent blood feuds between families, which were a necessary part of a social code where your reputation was everything. A leader who looked weak would quickly lose the respect of his own men. The political world was treacherous. A jarl was constantly maneuvering, balancing his loyalty to a king with his own ambitions and his rivalries with his neighbors. Alliances were fragile and could change overnight. A lord had to be a smart diplomat, good at making friends through gifts and parties, but also a ruthless strategist, ready to jump on a rival's weakness. Power struggles were common, and a jarl who let his guard down could lose everything. And leading your men in battle wasn't a job you could delegate. A jarl was expected to be on the front lines with his warriors. This was how he proved his courage and rewarded his followers with loot. A big win would cement his authority, but a major defeat could be a disaster, costing him not just land and wealth, but the loyalty of the very men sworn to protect him. Finally, there was the constant pressure to provide for his people. A jarl's followers expected to be well rewarded for their loyalty. This meant good food, plenty of drink, nice clothes, and a share of any treasure. Generosity wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was a political necessity. A lord who was seen as stingy or whose lands weren't doing well would find his warriors drifting off to serve a more successful and generous leader. The life of a Viking conqueror was a precarious balancing act. The high seat was a place of great honor, but it was never a place of rest. So, the world of the Viking elite was a far cry from the simple picture of axe-wielding barbarians. The great conquerors of the Norse world, the powerful jarls and kings, were complex people playing a sophisticated game of power, and that game was played in the feasting hall just as often as it was on the battlefield. Their lives show us that real, lasting power is built not just on force, but on a foundation of wealth, strategy, and social influence. Their incredible riches came from a smart, diverse portfolio. The steady, generational wealth from their huge farms, the globe-spanning profits of trade that brought silks and silver to their homes, and the brutal, high-stakes jackpots from raiding. This wealth was put on display for everyone to see in their colorful clothes, their heavy gold and silver jewelry, and most of all, in the sheer size of their longhouses. These incredible halls were the center of their universe, the headquarters of political power, the hub of social life, and the stage where they performed their authority every single day through huge feasts and strategic generosity. Life for the elite was a demanding balancing act. It required the skill to lead warriors into a shield wall, but also the brains to manage a massive farm. It demanded the cunning to navigate a web of shaky alliances and the constant need to defend one's honor in a world that valued reputation above all else. By looking beyond the longship and into the longhouse, we find a much richer, more interesting story. It's a story of shrewd politicians, strategic landlords, and global traders who understood that power had many sides. The legacy of the Viking conquerors isn't just written in the stories of the lands they raided. It's also found in the remains of their grand halls, the foreign coins buried in their soil, and the epic sagas that tell of a society built on a complex dance of wealth, honor, and power. If you found this look into the hidden world of the Viking elite interesting, do us a favor and hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. What part of the elite Viking life surprised you the most? Let us know down in the comments. We really do read all of them.